The air in the Onyx Canary was thick enough to drink. A heady cocktail of forbidden skin, French perfume, and the sweet, cloying smoke of imported cigarettes. It clung to the velvet curtains and seeped into the dark wood of the bar, a ghost of 1,000 whispered secrets and broken resolution. On stage, a 7-piece band blared a soulful, mournful tune from a saxophone, a sound that wrapped around the room like a lover's arm, pulling the dancers on the polished floor closer together. It was 1926, and here, in this glittering pocket of the city, hidden behind an unmarked door, the Volstad Act was nothing more than a distant, puritanical joke. Clara Mayfield felt like a ghost herself, a pale imitation of the women who truly belonged in this world. The dress she wore, a deep sapphire-beaded silk that shimmered under the dim golden lights, was borrowed. It was a size too large in the shoulders and a whisper too tight across the hips, a constant, nagging reminder that she was an imposter. Her dark, bobbed hair, usually pinned back with ruthless efficiency for her work at the textile mill, was now styled in soft waves that tickled her cheeks, a pathetic attempt to mimic the fashionable flappers whose laughter rang out like tiny, careless bells. She held a glass of ginger ale, the bubbles doing nothing to soothe the frantic fluttering in her stomach. Her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sea, scanned the room, not with pleasure, but with the sharp, desperate focus of a hunter. Every flash of a diamond bracelet, every casual flick of a gold-plated lighter, was a calculation. Her target had to be perfect, wealthy enough not to immediately miss a few $100, drunk enough to be careless, and solitary enough that his companions wouldn't notice the delicate lift. Her gaze kept returning to her own hands, resting on the cool glass. They were her most telling betrayal. While the other women flaunted manicured nails and soft, pampered skin, Clara's hands told the story of long hours, harsh lye soap, and the constant fear of a needle's prick. Tonight she wore a pair of thin lace gloves, a futile attempt to hide the truth of her station. They felt like shackles. A wave of nausea rolled through her, so potent she had to grip the edge of the small round table to steady herself. The image of her brother, Eugene, swam before her eyes. His face, once round and flushed with the boisterous energy of a 12-year-old, was now thin and pale, his breath a shallow, rattling thing in the sterile quiet of the sanatorium. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, a death knell of polite, clinical terms: experimental treatment, significant cost, no guarantees. The mill paid her just enough to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. It didn't pay for miracles, and Eugene needed a miracle. That thought was the steel in her spine. It pushed back the fear, sharpened her resolve. She was not a thief. She was a sister, and she would do anything at all, to quiet the rasp in her brother's lungs. She found him then, a man in his late 50s, his face florid with drink and success. Harold Vance, a railroad magnate whose face she'd seen in the society pages. He was laughing loudly at something his companion, a blonde barely out of her teens, had whispered in his ear. His suit was immaculately tailored, but his movements were becoming clumsy. As he gestured grandly, his suit jacket fell open, revealing the corner of a thick, alligator skin wallet in his inner pocket. It was practically an invitation. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath, placed her glass down and began to move. Navigating the throng was like wading through a river of silk and champagne. The music shifted, the trumpet taking the lead in a frantic, joyful wail that mirrored the frantic, terrified beat of her heart. She moved with a feigned nonchalance, a small smile fixed on her lips, her eyes cast downward as if she were shy. A man in a tuxedo bumped into her, sloshing gin on the floor. He apologized profusely. She just nodded, her focus entirely on Vance's table near the edge of the dance floor. He was distracted, his attention wholly on the girl beside him. Now. It had to be now. Clara pretended to stumble, her body lurching toward his table as if she'd been pushed. "Oh, forgive me," she murmured, her voice a breathy apology. Her left hand braced against the back of his chair, while her right, cloaked in its delicate glove, slipped with practiced speed inside his jacket. Her fingers, cold as ice, brushed against the rough tweed, then the smooth, cool leather of the wallet. It was heavier than she'd imagined. For a split second, her conscience screamed at her, a final, desperate plea for decency. She silenced it with the image of Eugene gasping for air. Her fingers closed around it. She began to draw it out, the movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. She was a breath away from freedom, from the doctor's bill, from a fragile sliver of hope, and then an iron grip closed around her wrist. It wasn't Vance. He was still oblivious, chuckling at his companion. The hand that held her was not the soft, fleshy hand of a drunkard. It was hard, lean, and unforgiving. The pressure was immense, but controlled, a silent, absolute declaration of power. It didn't crush her bones, but it pinned her in place more effectively than any wall. Slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared it would break through, Clara turned her head. She followed the line of a perfectly tailored black suit sleeve, past a crisp white cuff, to the man who held her. He was standing just behind her, a spectre who had materialized from the smoke and shadows. He had not been there a moment ago. She was sure of it. He was tall, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the very air from around them. But it was his eyes that truly stole her breath. They were the color of slate, cold and utterly devoid of emotion, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, analytical intensity. He wasn't looking at her as a woman, or even a person. He was looking at her as one might examine a faulty piece of machinery. Walter Blackwood. She knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name. It was whispered in fear and awe. He owned the Onyx Canary. He owned the docks, the distilleries, the unions. He was a king in an empire of shadows, a man who moved with a lethal grace that contradicted the whispered rumors of his brutality. And she had just tried to steal from a guest in his club. The jazz music, once a vibrant pulse of life, now sounded like a funeral dirge. The laughter of the crowd became a mocking chorus. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She expected him to shout, to call for his brutes to drag her into a back alley. She expected the brutal efficiency of a gangster's justice, or at the very least, the public humiliation of being handed over to the police. Her fingers went limp, and the wallet slipped from her grasp, falling back into the safety of Vance's pocket with a soft, muffled thud. The magnate didn't even notice. Walter Blackwood's gaze flickered from her face, down to her wrist, where his long, powerful fingers were still wrapped around her. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of any reaction. The silence between them stretched for an eternity. He made no move to expose her. Instead, he leaned in, his voice so low it was barely a murmur against the noise of the club, a gravelly sound that sent a shiver of pure terror down her spine. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but his fingers slid down to encircle her elbow, guiding her with an unyielding pressure. He turned, and she had no choice but to move with him. He led her away from the dance floor, through the labyrinth of tables. People fell silent as he passed. The boisterous energy of the club seemed to dim in his wake, the patrons turning away, suddenly finding their drinks or their companions intensely fascinating. No one met his eyes. No one looked at the pale, terrified girl he was steering through the room. It was as if they were invisible. Clara's mind raced. Where was he taking her? To his office? To a back room from which she would not emerge? Each step was a lifetime. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and something cold, like winter air. It was a jarring contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. They reached a heavy oak door at the back of the club, one she hadn't noticed before, set flush against a wall of dark brocade wallpaper. He released her elbow, only to retrieve a key from his pocket. The lock clicked, with a sound of finality, like a cell door slamming shut. He pushed the door open, revealing not a storage room or a dark alley, but a plush carpeted hallway, lit by a single elegant sconce. He gestured for her to enter. Her feet felt like lead. Her entire body screamed at her to run, but she knew it was useless. There was no escape from Walter Blackwood in his own kingdom. With the last of her courage, she lifted her chin, met his cold, unreadable eyes, and stepped over the threshold, leaving the music and the light of the onyx canary behind. The heavy door swung shut behind them, plunging them into a terrifying, intimate silence. The hallway was a tunnel of silence, swallowing the last echoes of the jazz band. The thick Persian runner muffled their footsteps, creating an unnerving sense of weightlessness. Clara felt as if she were floating toward her own execution. Walter Blackwood's hand remained a firm, unyielding presence on her back, guiding her forward. He walked with a quiet, predatory grace, his posture ramrod straight, his presence filling the narrow space completely. He stopped before a final door at the end of the hall, this one of polished mahogany with a simple, unadorned brass handle. He opened it and ushered her inside before following and closing it with a soft, definitive click. The sound was a death knell to her last, foolish hope of escape. The room was not the den of a brutish gangster she might have imagined. It was an office, but it felt more like a scholar's library or a king's private study. The air was cool and smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco that was never smoked, and the crisp scent of paper. Floaty ceiling bookshelves lined two walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked read, not merely displayed. A massive mahogany desk, its surface clear, save for a single black telephone and a perfectly aligned stack of papers, dominated the center of the room. Behind it, a tall window overlooked a dark, manicured garden, the city's distant glow a faint smudge on the horizon. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, only an imposing oil painting of a stormy seascape hanging on the wall opposite the desk. It was a space of absolute order and control. Walter moved around the desk and sat in the large, throne-like leather chair. He did not invite her to sit. He simply watched her, his slate-gray eyes taking in her borrowed dress, her trembling hands, her defiant chin. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was a weapon, and he wielded it with terrifying expertise. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, the sound deafening in the stillness. She forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze, refusing to be the first to break. Finally, he spoke. His voice was the same low, gravelly tone as before, but in the quiet of the office, it held an amplified power. "What is your name?" Her own voice was a dry whisper. "Clara. Clara Mayfield." "Clara Mayfield," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and insignificant on his tongue. He leaned forward slightly, lacing his long fingers together on the polished surface of the desk. "You are not a professional, Miss Mayfield. Your hands are shaking." You hesitated. A professional would have had the wallet and been lost in the crowd before Harold Vance even registered the breeze. His observation was so clinical, so detached. It was more unnerving than an accusation. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. The shame of it burned hotter than fear. She started, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? "Why?" he asked, his voice cutting through her paralysis. "Why risk everything in a place like this? My place." The possessive emphasis was subtle but clear. This was his domain, and she had committed sacrilege. The women who come to the Onyx Canary are dripping in jewels. The men carry enough cash to buy a new Ford T, but they are all under my protection. So you weren't just stealing from a drunk railroad magnate, you were stealing from me. Double quotes. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and furious. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction. She lifted her chin higher. I needed the money. A flicker of something, amusement, contempt, passed through his eyes. An uninspired yet classic defense. Everyone needs money. What makes your need so special that it gave you the audacity to try this? The word audacity broke something inside her. It wasn't audacity. It was desperation, a hollow, gnawing thing that had chewed away at her pride until nothing was left. The carefully constructed wall of composure she had built around herself crumbled. My brother, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush, raw and ragged. Your name is Eugene. He's 12. He's sick. His lungs, they're failing. He's at the Gable Hills Sanatorium, and there's a new treatment, an experimental one from Switzerland. The doctor said it's his only chance. The clinical terms she had memorized now felt like daggers on her tongue. It costs more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes working at the mill. I tried to borrow. I sold everything we owned of any value. There was nothing left. She finally looked away from him, her gaze falling to her own gloved hands, now twisted together in a knot. I'm not a thief, she whispered, more to herself than to him, but he can't breathe, and I can't. I can't just stand by and watch him die. She fell silent, her confession hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. She expected him to scoff, to call her a liar, to dismiss her story as a pathetic, transparent plea for sympathy. She braced herself for the cold, final verdict. Instead, Walter Blackwood was quiet for a long time. He didn't move, his eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be dissecting her, analyzing every word, every tremble of her lip, every flicker of pain in her eyes. He was looking for the lie, the flaw in her story. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The cold edge was still there, but it was layered with something else, something calculating. Gable Hills, he mused aloud. Dr. Albright's facility. Expensive and discreet. He knew of it. Of course he did. He knew everything. He picked up the telephone receiver, his movements economical and precise. He spoke a single name into the mouthpiece. Roy. A pause. Get me everything you can on a patient at Gable Hills, a boy, Eugene Mayfield, and find out about his sister, Clara Mayfield. He hung up the receiver with a soft click. Clara stared at him, her blood running cold. He was checking her story. She hadn't been lying, but the invasion of it, the cold, methodical violation of her private tragedy, made her feel exposed and small. They waited in silence again. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 years. Clara remained standing, her muscles aching with tension. Walter sat perfectly still, a statue of carved stone and tailored wool. Just as she thought she would break from the suspense, the telephone rang, a shrill, jarring sound in the oppressive quiet. He answered. He didn't speak, just listened, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. She watched a series of imperceptible emotions cross his features. He nodded once, then twice. I see, he said into the phone. Thank you, Roy. He hung up. The finality of the act made her stomach clench. This was it. Judgment. Your story, he began, his voice flat as true. A father lost in the Great War. A mother to influenza 3 years ago. You've been supporting the boy on a mill worker's salary ever since. Dr. Albright confirms the diagnosis and the cost of the treatment. He paused, leaning back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. It was no longer the look of a man interrogating a thief. It was the look of a connoisseur, examining a rare and potentially valuable object. You have courage, Miss Mayfield. Foolish, reckless courage. But courage, nonetheless. You have poise, even when you're terrified. And you have a face that could make men forget their own names. He stated it as a simple fact, like observing the color of the sky. These are assets. Clara didn't understand. Assets. I don't. I have a proposition for you, he interrupted, cutting straight to the point. A business arrangement. She stared at him, bewildered. A proposition. She had expected a jail cell or a shallow grave, not a negotiation. I will pay for your brother's treatment, he stated calmly. All of it. I will move him to a private suite. He will have the best doctors, the best nurses, anything he requires. I will also provide you with a generous stipend. You will never have to set foot in that textile mill again. You will live in a world of comfort you cannot currently imagine. Clara's mind reeled. It was impossible. A dream. There had to be a catch. A terrible, monstrous catch. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice trembling. Walter Blackwood stood up, the sheer size and power of him seeming to shrink the opulent office. He walked round the desk and stopped a few feet in front of her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. I am a man who commands fear and a certain kind of respect, he said, his voice low and intense. But in the circles I wish to enter, the world of legitimate industry, of politics, of old money, that is not enough. I am seen as a brute, a gangster from the gutter who got lucky. A flicker of profound bitterness crossed his face before vanishing. I require a veneer of respectability, a symbol of softness to balance my reputation. He looked directly into her eyes, and the full, shocking weight of his intention finally crashed down upon her. I need a wife, he said. You, Miss Mayfield, will become Mrs. Blackwood. You will be my wife in name and in public. You will stand by my side at galas, host my dinner parties, and smile for the society pages. Your grace and beauty will be my shield. In return for this performance, your brother lives, and you want for nothing. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Wife? His wife. It was the most insane, preposterous thing she had ever heard. It was a trade, her life for Eugene's. A gilded cage, as he had said, a world of comfort built on a foundation of lies. You would marry a stranger, a thief? She stammered, horrified. I am not interested in a love match, he replied, his voice cold as steel. I am interested in an acquisition. You are desperate. I have a need. It's the purest form of transaction. There will be rules, of course. Separate rooms, public affection, private distance. You will be my wife for all the world to see, but a stranger under my own roof. Your only duties are to be beautiful, to be poised, and to be convincing. He watched her, waiting. He had laid the terms on the table. The choice was hers, but it wasn't a choice at all. On one side was Eugene, his rattling breath, the sterile white walls of the sanatorium, and certain death. On the other was this man, this cold, dangerous stranger, offering a lifeline wrapped in chains of gold. She thought of her brother's smile, of the way he used to run through the fields before the sickness took hold. She thought of the doctor's pitying eyes. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. Taking a deep, ragged breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, Clara Mayfield looked up at the most powerful and feared man in the city and sealed her fate. I accept. The ride from the Onyx Canary was a silent, surreal journey through the sleeping city. Clara sat on the plush leather seat of a gleaming black Pierce Sarrow, a car so quiet it seemed to glide rather than drive. Walter Blackwood sat beside her, though a chasm of unspoken rules and cold realities separated them. He hadn't spoken a word since she'd accepted his proposal. He simply stared out the window at the gas lamps blurring past, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a blade against the dark glass. The man at the wheel, whom Walter had addressed only as Roy, was a compact, stone-faced figure who drove with an unnerving smoothness, his eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror, cataloguing her presence without acknowledgement. Clara felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a scene from a moving picture. The woman in the sapphire dress, sitting in a gangster's car, being driven to an unknown fate that couldn't possibly be her. Just hours ago, she had been Clara Mayfield, mill worker and worried sister, her world smelling of machine oil and cheap soap. Now, she was an assad, an acquisition, the future Mrs. Blackwood. The title felt like a costume she had yet to try on, heavy and suffocating. They left the city's pulsing heart behind, moving into a neighborhood of silent, imposing mansions that stood like slumbering giants behind rattan fences. Roy turned the car through a set of gates that were so tall and ornate they could have guarded a palace. They opened without a sound, as if by magic. A long, winding driveway curved through a landscape of perfectly manicured lawns and skeletal winter trees, ending before a house that swallowed the moonlight. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of dark stone and ivy, with tall, narrow windows that looked like vacant eyes. It was grand and opulent, but it held no warmth, no welcome. It was a monument to power, not a home. Roy brought the car to a stop and was out in an instant, opening Walter's door. Walter emerged without a word and walked toward the massive front doors. Roy then came round and opened Clara's door. She hesitated, her hand clutching the small, worn purse that held her last few dollars, the only remaining piece of her old life. "Miss Mayfield," Roy said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. It was the first time he'd spoken to her, taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic bird in her chest. She stepped out. The doors of the mansion were opened from within by a uniformed butler who looked old enough to have been carved from the same stone as the house. Walter was already inside, his shadow long and imposing in the cavernous, marble-floored foyer. A crystal chandelier, unlit, hung from the impossibly high ceiling like a web of frozen tears. "Roy," Walter said, his back still to her, as he removed his gloves, "see that Mrs. Mayfield is shown to the East Wing suite. Arrange for the dressmakers, the jewelers, the cobblers. Everything she requires. She is to be ready in 1 week." His voice echoed in the tomb-like silence. He didn't look at her. He simply issued orders concerning his new possession. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," Roy replied. Walter turned then, his slate-grey eyes meeting hers across the expanse of polished marble. "Your brother's transfer to the private suite will be completed by morning. Dr. Albright will have everything he needs. You have upheld your end of the bargain. I am now upholding mine." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Good night, Miss Mayfield," and with that he ascended the grand, sweeping staircase, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor, leaving her alone with the two silent men. The week that followed was a blur of calculated transformation. Clara's life became a series of appointments, fittings, and lessons, all orchestrated with the cool efficiency of a military campaign by Roy. He was her guide, her warden, and her instructor. He spoke only when necessary, his face a perpetual mask of professional detachment. He taught her the names of the household staff, the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, the silent, ghost-like maids, the ancient butler, Arthur, all of whom treated her with a chilling, formal politeness. She was the mistress of the house, yet she felt like its most prominent and carefully watched prisoner. Her worn-out clothes vanished, replaced by a wardrobe that filled a room-sized closet. Dresses of silk, crepe de chine, and velvet in every conceivable color. Rows of shoes with delicate straps and impossibly high heels. Hats adorned with feathers and ribbons. A jeweler, a man with nervous, fluttering hands, came and fitted her with pearls, diamonds, and sapphires that matched her new gowns. A hairdresser was summoned to trim and style her bob into a more fashionable, severe line. They were all molding her, sculpting her into the perfect image of Mrs. Walter Blackwood. Each morning, a crisp typewritten note was delivered with her solitary breakfast tray, detailing Eugene's progress. Patient's breathing has eased, responding well to initial phase of treatment. Appetite improving. The notes were unsigned, as impersonal as a stock market report. They were a constant, painful reminder of why she was here. She had saved her brother, but in doing so, had been exiled from his life. She was not allowed to visit, Troy had made that clear. It would raise unnecessary questions, he'd stated, and that was the end of it. Loneliness became her constant companion. She wandered the silent, opulent rooms of the mansion, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. She traced the patterns on priceless tapestries and stared at portraits of stern-faced ancestors who were not her own. The house was a museum, and she was its newest, loneliest exhibit. Meals were eaten alone at one end of a dining table long enough to seat 30, the food exquisite, but turning to ash in her mouth. In this vast, empty cage, Walter Blackwood was a phantom. She rarely saw him. Their paths were designed not to cross. He left before she awoke, and returned long after she had retired to her suite. The east wing was hers, and the west wing was his. The house was a kingdom divided, and yet his presence was everywhere in the fear-tinged respect of the staff, in the scent of his sandalwood cologne that sometimes lingered in the hall, in the sheer oppressive weight of his power that defined the very walls around her. She began to watch for him, to learn his habits from a distance, driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate, gnawing curiosity. Who was this man who had bought her life? The first crack in his armor appeared late one night. Sleep was a fickle visitor, and she was pacing the length of her sitting room when a faint sound drifted up from the floor below. It was music, but not the riotous jazz of his club. This was something else entirely, a single, soaring tenor voice, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to make the very air vibrate. It was an opera aria, a lament of heartbreak and despair. Drawn by the sound, Clara slipped out of her room, her bare feet silent on the cold runner in the hallway. She followed the music down the grand staircase, its heartbreaking beauty a stark contrast to the cold austerity of the house. It led her to the library, the very room where her fate had been sealed. The door was cracked open, just enough for a sliver of amber light to spill into the foyer. She peered through the gap. The room was dark, save for a single lamp on the desk. A phonograph on a nearby table was the source of the music, its brass horn gleaming, and in the large leather chair, facing away from her, toward the dark, rain-streaked window, sat Walter. He wasn't working. He was just sitting in the near dark, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. He was utterly still, a silhouette of solitude, letting the music wash over him. In that moment, he didn't look like a gangster or a king. He looked like a man utterly and completely alone, communing with a ghost of sorrow she couldn't begin to understand. She felt an unexpected and unwelcome pang of something that felt dangerously close to empathy. She retreated as silently as she had come, the mournful music following her back to her room. The second glimpse came a few days later, on a grey, misty morning. She was standing at her bedroom window, looking out over the sprawling, formal gardens. They were pristine, geometric, and lifeless in the winter chill. But to the side, tucked away behind a high stone wall and a heavy wooden gate, was another, smaller garden she hadn't noticed before. As she watched, the gate opened, and Walter stepped through. He wasn't dressed in one of his immaculate suits. He wore simple trousers and a thick woolen sweater, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He moved with a purpose she recognized, but it was a different kind of purpose. He knelt in the damp earth beside a collection of dormant rose bushes, their branches like thorny skeletons. With a pair of shears, he began to prune them, his movements careful, gentle, and precise. He touched the thorny stems with a familiarity that spoke of long practice. For nearly an hour she watched, mesmerized, as the feared Walter Blackwood, The ruthless ruler of the city's underworld tended his secret garden. He was nurturing something, protecting it, coaxing life from the sleeping earth. These stolen moments confused her more than his threats ever could. The cold, calculating man who had purchased her was also a man who listened to tragic opera alone in the dark and cultivated roses. The monster, it seemed, had a soul, and that possibility was, in its own way, more frightening than anything else. It suggested a complexity, a depth to her captor that she was not prepared for. Her cage was still a cage, but she was slowly becoming aware of the strange, enigmatic nature of the man who held the key. The grand ballroom of the Astor Hotel was a different world from the Onyx Canary. Here, the law wasn't broken. It was politely ignored behind a facade of glittering respectability. There was no smoky, illicit thrill, only the cool, blue-blooded confidence of old money. A full orchestra played a sweeping waltz from a gilded balcony, the sound washing over a sea of men in stark black and white tuxedos, and women who dripped with the hereditary jewels of their grandmothers. Champagne flowed not from hidden flasks, but from pyramids of crystal flutes, served by waiters in pristine white gloves. Clara felt as if she were floating. She was encased in a gown of shimmering silver silk, a creation so exquisitely beaded it seemed spun from moonlight and frost. Around her throat lay a necklace of diamonds, so heavy and cold she was constantly aware of its presence, like a beautiful, jeweled leash. Her hand rested delicately on Walter's arm, her fingers clad in long, white silk gloves. She was the perfect picture of Mrs. Walter Blackwood, a masterpiece of the city's finest artisans, a living, breathing symbol of her husband's success. For the past week she had rehearsed this role in her mind, studying photographs in society magazines, practicing a serene, distant smile in her mirror. Now, on the stage, she found a strange strength in the performance. The mask of the elegant socialite was a kind of armor. Behind it, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But on the surface, she was calm, her posture perfect, her gaze sweeping over the crowd with a practiced, gentle curiosity. Walter was a formidable presence at her side. He moved through the elite crowd with a quiet, lethal confidence that parted them like the sea. Men who ran the city's banks and industries, men who had never set foot in his downtown clubs, nodded to him with a respect that was clearly tinged with fear. Their wives appraised Clara with sharp, assessing glances, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Clara was the mystery of the season, the unknown woman who had captured the city's most dangerous and elusive bachelor. "Smile," Walter murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear as they paused to greet a portly senator. "You look beautiful when you smile. It makes the illusion more convincing." His words were a cold splash of reality, a reminder that this was all a transaction. She was a prop, and he was her director. She inclined her head, the diamonds cold against her skin, and produced the gentle, enigmatic smile she had practiced. The senator's wife gushed about her beauty, asking where Mr. Blackwood had been hiding her. "Some treasures are best kept private," Walter answered smoothly, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on the small of Clara's back. It was a gesture of possession, a clear, silent warning to the room. They danced. Walter led her onto the floor for the first waltz, his hand firm on her waist, his movements precise and controlled. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer. For a few dizzying moments, caught in the swell of the music and the glittering lights, Clara almost forgot who they were. She was just a woman in a beautiful gown, held in the arms of a handsome, powerful man. He held her just a little too close for propriety, his chin brushing the top of her head. "You are performing admirably, Mrs. Blackwood," he whispered, his breath warm against her hair. "I'm glad my work meets your satisfaction, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her tone cool, reminding them both of the truth. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. Indeed, they were halfway through the waltz when she saw the man watching them. He stood near a marble column, a glass of champagne held loosely in his hand. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, with blonde hair combed back from his forehead and a smile that was all teeth. But his eyes were cold, like chips of blue ice. They weren't looking at the couple on the dance floor. They were fixed solely on Clara, with an intensity that was both flattering and deeply unsettling. "Who is that man?" she asked Walter quietly, trying to sound casual. Walter's entire body went rigid. His arm tightened around her waist, pulling her even closer, and his steps didn't falter, but she felt a sudden, dangerous stillness emanate from him. His gaze followed hers, and when he saw the man, his own eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "Clarence Vance," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He owns the shipping interests to the north, and he wants mine." The name Vance pricked at her memory. Harold Vance, the man whose wallet she had tried to steal. Was there a connection? Before she could ask, the music ended. The dancers applauded politely, and as Walter led her from the floor, Clarence Vance began to move toward them, his slick smile widening. "Blackwood," Vance said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying sharpness. "I almost didn't recognize you. Marriage seems to have domesticated you." He ignored Walter and turned his full attention to Clara, his eyes sweeping over her in a way that made her skin crawl. He took her gloved hand and bowed low, pressing his lips to it for a fraction of a second too long. "And this must be the lovely creature responsible for the miracle." "Clarence Vance." "It is an absolute honor, Mrs. Blackwood." "A pleasure, Mr. Vance," Clara replied, withdrawing her hand as gracefully as she could. "The pleasure is all mine," Vance purred, his eyes still locked on hers. "Your husband is a man of many hidden talents, but acquiring something of such exquisite rarity is perhaps his greatest accomplishment to date. Tell me, where did he find you?" The question was a dagger wrapped in velvet. It implied she was a commodity, an object to be found and acquired. She felt Walter tense beside her, a coiled spring of violence. Before he could speak, Clara found her own voice, cool and steady. "I believe the story is quite the opposite, Mr. Vance," she said, her practiced smile firmly in place. "I am the one who found him quite untamed. I simply decided he was a project worth undertaking." A flicker of genuine surprise, then amusement, crossed Vance's face. Walter's hand on her back relaxed almost imperceptibly. Vance let out a low chuckle. "A woman with spirit. I see the appeal. A man must be careful with new treasures, though, Blackwood. They are so easily broken, or misplaced." The air grew thick with unspoken menace. This was it. The threat she'd read about in cheap novels, now laid bare in a glittering ballroom. It was not aimed at Walter. It was aimed at her. Clarence Vance had looked at the board, identified Walter's new piece, and immediately recognized her as his weakness. Walter stepped forward slightly, subtly placing himself between Clara and his rival. His movement was fluid, almost casual, but it was the motion of a wolf shielding its mate. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously soft. "I have always found, Vance," he said, "that I am exceptionally good at holding on to what is mine, and I am even better at destroying those who try to take it from me." The politeness was gone. The raw, brutal gangster from the docks was standing in the middle of the Astor Hotel ballroom, and for the first time, the men and women nearby seemed to notice the shift in the atmosphere. They began to drift away, leaving the three of them in a small, charged circle of isolation. Clarence Vance's smile never faltered, but the amusement in his eyes died, replaced by a cold, reptilian gleam. "We shall see," he said. He gave Clara one last, lingering look. "A delight, Mrs. Blackwood. I do hope we'll see much more of each other." He nodded once to Walter, a gesture of mock respect, and then turned and melted back into the crowd. The spell of the evening was shattered. The music, the laughter, the glittering lights, it all seemed like a grotesque parody now. All Clara could feel was the lingering chill of Vance's threat and the radiating heat of Walter's silent, contained rage. "We are leaving," Walter said, his voice clipped. He took her elbow in a grip that was just shy of painful and steered her toward the exit, his apologies to their host and other acquaintances short and dismissive. They didn't speak in the coat check, nor on the cold stone steps of the hotel, where Roy was waiting with the Pierce Sarrow, the engine already purring. The ride back to the mansion was shrouded in a silence more profound and terrifying than any she had yet experienced with him. Walter sat beside her, staring straight ahead, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. The muscle in his jaw jumped, a testament to the fury he was holding in check. Clara watched his reflection in the dark window. She had seen the cold businessman. She had glimpsed the lonely man with his opera and his roses. But tonight, in that ballroom, she had seen the monster. She had seen the predator that lurked just beneath the surface of the tailored suit, and she had realized, with a sudden sickening clarity, that the monster's fury had been ignited on her behalf. She was no longer just a participant in a business arrangement. She was the target in a war she didn't understand, between two men who played for the highest stakes. Her gilded cage, which had once seemed so lonely and safe, now felt fragile, its bars made of glass. And the dangerous man beside her, her captor, had just become her only protector. The thought was the most terrifying of all. The days following the charity ball were heavy with a new, unspoken tension. The fragile piece of Clara's gilded cage had been shattered. Now, when she wandered the silent halls of the mansion, she felt the phantom chill of Vance's gaze, heard the echo of his veiled threat. The house no longer felt merely empty, it felt exposed. Walter's presence, once a rare and fleeting thing, became more constant. He worked from his study more often, and the Pierce Sarrow remained in the garage for days at a time. A second man, a broad-shouldered shadow who moved with the quiet lethality of Roy, was now stationed near the front gates. Clara knew without being told that she was under guard. The shift in their dynamic was subtle but profound. They still ate their meals separately, still occupied opposite ends of the vast house, but an invisible current now flowed between them. When their paths did cross in the foyer, or along the upstairs gallery, his slate-grey eyes would lock on her for a moment longer than necessary. A silent, intense assessment that had nothing to do with her performance as his wife and everything to do with her safety. She was no longer just an asset, she was a liability. The thought should have made her feel even more like a prisoner, but strangely it did not. One evening, nearly a week after the ball, the tension finally snapped. Clara was in her sitting room trying to lose herself in a novel, but the words blurred on the page. A storm had rolled in off the coast, and a violent, driving rain lashed against the windows, each gust of wind sounding like an intruder testing the latches. The house groaned around her, and every creak and shadow sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. The typewritten notes about Eugene had continued their steady, reassuring rhythm, but even that comfort felt distant tonight. Suddenly, a series of sounds from outside cut through the storm's fury. The squill of tires on the wet gravel of the driveway, a shouted command that was swallowed by the wind, and then a deafening bang that was not thunder. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a gunshot. Clara's book fell from her hands. Her heart leaped into her throat, beating a wild, frantic tattoo against her ribs. She flew to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. In the sweeping arc of the Pierce Sarrow's headlamps, she saw a chaotic scene. Roy was half-crouched behind the open car door, a pistol held steady in his hand, aimed at a second, darker vehicle that was already speeding away, its taillights vanishing into the rain and darkness down the long driveway. And then she saw Walter. He was stumbling out of the passenger side of his car, his hand pressed against his left shoulder. Even from a distance, through the sheets of rain, she could see the dark stain spreading across the fabric of his light grey suit. He waved Roy off, straightening with a visible, agonizing effort as he staggered toward the house. Forgetting every rule of their arrangement, forgetting her fear, Clara ran. She flew down the grand staircase, her silk robe whispering against the steps, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble of the foyer. She reached the massive front doors, just as Walter pushed them open, leaning heavily against the frame. He was pale, his face a tight mask of pain. Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and water dripped from his jaw, mingling with the blood that now soaked his entire shoulder and sleeve. His cold, slate-grey eyes widened in surprise when he saw her standing there, her face a mess of terror and concern. "Clara," he rasped, his voice rough. "Go back to your room. You'll hurt," she breathed, ignoring his command. She reached for him, her hands hovering uncertainly near his wounded arm. "It's a scratch," he gritted out, pushing past her and striding, with a faltering but determined gait, toward his study. She followed him without hesitation. The butler, Arthur, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had appeared as if from nowhere, their faces pale and horrified. "Sir, shall I call Dr. Evans?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling slightly. "No," Walter snapped over his shoulder. "No doctors. Get me whiskey, bandages, and hot water. Now." Clara followed him into the study and closed the door behind them, shutting out the concerned staff. He had collapsed into the large leather chair behind his desk, his head falling back against the cushions, his eyes squeezed shut against a wave of pain. His control was fraying at the edges, the iron mask cracking under the strain. "Let me see," she said, her voice soft but firm. He opened his eyes, a flash of his old commanding anger in them. "I said, go back." "And I am not leaving," she interrupted, surprising them both. She moved around the desk and gently, but insistently, began to work at the buttons of his suit jacket. His body was rigid with pain, but he didn't stop her. She eased the blood-soaked jacket off his shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. The white shirt beneath was ruined, stained a horrifying brilliant crimson. A neat, dark hole had been torn through the fabric high on his shoulder. "The bullet went through," she observed, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's clean." "That's good." In her previous life she had seen her share of mill accident, scrushed fingers, deep gashes. The sight of blood did not make her faint. Arthur returned with a silver tray bearing a decanter of amber liquid, a bowl of steaming water, clean cloths, and a roll of bandages. He placed it on the desk and retreated silently. Clara poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a cloth, the sharp, antiseptic smell filling the air. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Walter just gritted his teeth and gave a curt nod. She pressed the cloth to the wound. He let out a sharp, ragged hiss of breath, his entire body convulsing, but he made no other sound. As she cleaned the entry and exit wounds, her fingers worked with a deft, practiced care. The proximity was dizzying. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the rain and the metallic tongue of blood on him. She was touching him, not as a prop or a possession, but as a caregiver, a person. The barriers of their cold arrangement evaporated in the intimate, urgent silence of the room. When the wound was clean, she began to bandage it, her movements sure and efficient. He watched her the entire time, his intense gaze fixed on her face, his expression stripped bare of all its usual defenses. She saw not the gangster, not the cold businessman, but a man in pain, a man who was vulnerable. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice a low rumble. "Why didn't you stay in your room?" She finished tying the bandage and met his gaze. Her own defenses were gone, washed away by the adrenaline and a wave of emotion she couldn't name. "Because I was afraid," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not afraid of blood." "No," she admitted. "I was afraid for you." The admission hung in the air between them, more shocking than a gunshot, more intimate than her touch. For a long, breathless moment, they simply looked at each other. The storm raged outside, but inside the study, a different kind of storm was breaking. The cold facade he had so carefully maintained for his entire life finally crumbled. A look of profound weariness, of a pain far older than his physical wound, settled over his features. "This respectability I'm chasing," he said, his voice raw with a bitterness that seemed to come from his very soul. "It's not just for business, Clara. It's not just about deals and politics." He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the painting of the stormy sea. "I grew up with nothing, in a part of this city where violence was the only language that mattered. I learned it well. I used it to claw my way out, but it follows me. It stains everything I touch." He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that startled her. "I thought if I built something clean, a beautiful house, a legitimate empire, a graceful wife, I could build a wall around that part of myself, keep it locked away. But Vance, he sees through it all. He knows what I am, and he knows that you are the cleanest thing I have ever had." Her heart ached for him, for the boy who had learned the language of violence, for the man who listened to opera alone in the dark. The carefully constructed lines of their arrangement, employer and employee, captor and captive, had blurred into something else entirely. She didn't think, she simply acted. She reached out and gently cupped his jaw, her thumb brushing against the rough stubble on his cheek. He flinched, as if unused to a gentle touch, but then leaned into her hand, his eyes closing for a brief second. "You are more than what you came from, Walter," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. He opened his eyes, and the sheer raw emotion in them stole her breath. He slowly lifted his uninjured hand, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, his touch surprisingly hesitant. The space between them crackled with all the things they had never said, all the emotions they had kept locked away. And then he leaned forward, closing the small distance between them. His lips met hers, not with the force or passion she might have expected, but with a desperate, searching tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of rain, whiskey, and a lifetime of loneliness. It was hesitant and unsure at first, a question asked in the dark. Clara answered by kissing him back, her own fear and confusion melting into a powerful, undeniable wave of feeling. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, honest expression of the terror of the night, the loneliness of their lives, and the startling, dangerous truth that had finally been spoken between them. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the dangers of their future, something new and terrifying and beautiful had just been born. The fragile truce, born from the violence of that night, changed everything. The silence between Walter and Clara was no longer a void of rules and distance, but a space filled with a quiet, humming tension. They began to take their dinners together at the long, imposing table, the space between them shrinking with each passing evening. He would talk to her, not about his business, but about the books in his library, the history of the city, the haunting operas he loved. She, in turn, would tell him about Eugene, about her childhood before the war, painting a picture of a life that seemed a world away from his. The physical barriers crumbled as well. One evening, finding her asleep in a chair in the library, a book fallen into her lap, he didn't wake her. He simply draped a cashmere blanket over her shoulders, his fingers lingering for a moment on her hair before retreating into the shadows. They had not repeated their kiss, but the memory of it lived in every shared glance, every accidental brush of their hands. Clara found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his car on the gravel, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar flutter when he walked into a room. She was falling for her captor, and the realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. This delicate, budding piece was a flower blooming on the edge of a volcano. They both knew it. The attack had been a warning from Clarence Vance, a promise of what was to come. The extra guard remained at the gate, and Roy now shadowed Clara whenever she used the gardens. The gilded cage had become a fortress, but they both knew no fortress was impenetrable. The blow, when it came, was not delivered with a bullet, but with a slip of yellow paper. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, a day so bright and crisp with the promise of spring that the danger felt like a distant dream. Arthur brought the telegram into the dining room where Walter and Clara were sharing a rare, quiet breakfast. Walter took it, his brow furrowed. Telegrams were for urgent news, rarely good. He slit the envelope with a butter knife, his movements precise, and unfolded the paper. Clara watched his face as he read. She saw the blood drain from it, leaving his skin a taut, ashen gray. The iron control he commanded so effortlessly shattered like glass. A look of pure, murderous fury, followed by a wave of something that looked devastatingly like despair, washed over his features. His hand, holding the flimsy paper, began to tremble. "Walter, what is it?" she asked, her voice laced with dread. He didn't seem to hear her. He just stared at the telegram as if willing the words to change. He looked up, his eyes finding hers, and in them she saw a bleak, terrible emptiness that chilled her to the bone. "He has him," Walter said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. "Vance, he has your brother." The world tilted and went silent. The only sound Clara could hear was the frantic, roaring rush of blood in her ears. Eugene, her reason for everything, the bright, innocent center of her world. A wave of nausea, so profound she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from fainting. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, he's at the sanatorium. He's safe." Walter slid the telegram across the polished table. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely pick it up. The typed letters were stark and clinical, a brutal contrast to the horror they conveyed. "Have the boy quietly removed. He is safe for now. Your docs and all warehouse contracts. Sign them over. My messenger will contact you with instructions. Tell the police, and the boy pays the price. You have 24 hours. CV." "I should have known," Walty snarled, slamming his fist on the table with such force that the fine china rattled. He pushed himself to his feet, pacing the room like a caged panther. "I strengthened the security here at the house. I never thought he'd be so craven, so vile as to go after a sick child. I underestimated his depravity. I put him in danger. Your brother is in this position because of me." The self-loathing in his voice was absolute. He saw this not as an attack by his enemy, but as his own personal failure. Clara stared at the yellow paper, the words blurring through her tears. Panic was a cold, constricting band around her chest, stealing her breath. Eugene, alone, terrified, in the hands of a monster like Vance. The image was unbearable, but through the fog of her terror, a strange clarity emerged. She looked at Walter, who was now standing by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with a mixture of rage and guilt. He was blaming himself, but she knew the truth. She was the one who had walked into his club. She had made the deal. Her desperation had brought this plague upon them both. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked to him. "This is not your fault, Walter," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "This is Vance's, and mine. We will get him back." He turned to her, his face a mask of torment. "He wants my empire, Clara. Everything I have spent my life building. The docks are the heart of it all. Without them," he trailed off. The choice was clear. The empire he had built, with blood and brutality, or the boy he barely knew. Clara looked him straight in the eye, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by an unshakable certainty. "It's just brick and mortar," she said softly. "It's just money. Eugene he's my whole world." And in that moment, she realized with a painful lurch of her heart, Walter had become a part of that world too. Any hesitation, any conflict Walter might have felt, vanished as he looked at her face. The choice was no choice at all. He had sought respectability, a family, a life beyond the violence. And here it was, in its most brutal and terrifying form. He had to choose between the symbols of his power and the reality of the people he had, against all odds, come to care for. "Get Roy," he said, his voice hard as flint, the calculating strategist taking over from the despairing man. "Tell him to meet me in the study in 5 minutes. And pack a small bag for your brother. Warm clothes. He'll need them when we bring him home." The word "we" was a promise. The certainty in his voice was a lifeline. The next few hours were a blur of tense, quiet activity. Clara packed a bag for Eugene, her hands moving automatically, her mind a maelstrom of prayer and fear. Downstairs in the study, Walter and Roy spoke in low, urgent tones. A map of the city's industrial waterfront spread across the desk between them. Walter made one phone call, his conversation cryptic and brief. He was calling in markers, activating a network of shadows and ghosts loyal only to him. He would not give Vance what he wanted. To do so would be to show a weakness that would be fatal in his world. He would not surrender his empire. He would risk it. He was going to meet Vance's barbarism with his own brand of ruthless cunning. Late that afternoon, the promised instructions came via a messenger boy. A meeting, midnight, an abandoned cannery warehouse on the southern Piers Vance's territory. Walter was to come alone, with the signed deeds. "It's a trap," Roy stated flatly, when Walter showed him the note. "He'll take the deeds and kill you both. The boy is just leverage." "I know," Walter said, his eyes cold and distant. "Which is why I will not be going alone." As night fell, a heavy, oppressive blanket over the city, Walter came to find Clara. She was in the foyer, pacing endlessly, the small bag for Eugene clutched in her hands. He stopped in front of her, his face grim in the dim light. He was dressed in dark, practical clothing, a long coat concealing whatever weapons he carried. The gangster had shed the skin of the refined businessman. "I am going now," he said. "I am coming with you," she stated, her chin set in a stubborn line. "Absolutely not," he countered, his voice sharp. "It's too dangerous. You will wait here." "He is my brother," she cried, her control finally snapping. "I have been a prisoner in this house. I have worn your clothes and your jewels. I have played the part of your wife. I did it all for him. I will not wait here helpless while his life is on the line. I am going." He looked at her, at the fire in her sea-storm eyes, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty that defined her very being. It was the same quality he had seen in her that first night in his club, that foolish, reckless courage. He had sought to use it for his own ends, and now it was turned on him, and he found he could not deny it. He could not deny her. "Stay in the car with Roy," he commanded, his voice softening into a tone of reluctant surrender. "No matter what you hear, you do not get out." "That is not a request, Clara. It is an order." She nodded, clutching the bag tighter. It was a compromise, but it was enough. She would be there. The ride to the docks was a journey into the city's dark underbelly. The gleaming mansions gave way to grimy tenements, the manicured lawns to cobbled streets, slick with rain and refuse. The air grew heavy with the smell of salt, fish, and decay. The Pier Sarro moved like a silent predator through the labyrinth of warehouses, its engine a low purr. Roy finally killed the engine, and the lights a block away from the designated warehouse, plunging them into near-total darkness. The cannery loomed before them, a skeletal silhouette against the faintly glowing, overcast sky. Its windows were dark, broken eyes. "This is it," Roy said, his hand already resting on the butt of the pistol tucked into his waistband. Walter turned to Clara in the back seat. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was a gesture of profound tenderness in a moment of extreme peril. "I will bring him back to you," he vowed, his voice a low, fierce promise. "I swear it." And then he was gone, melting into the shadows between the buildings, a ghost moving toward a confrontation that would determine all of their fates. Clara was left in the crushing silence of the car, her heart pounding in time with the mournful foghorn that echoed from the bay, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The silence in the car was a living thing, a suffocating presence that amplified every small sound, the distant clang of a ship's bell, the mournful cry of a gull, the frantic, drumming beat of her own heart. Clara stared at the derelict cannery, its dark, hulking form a mausoleum of her hopes. Every minute that Walter was inside stretched into an eternity. She clutched the small bag she had packed for Eugene, the soft wool of a sweater, a flimsy, tangible anchor in a sea of terror. Beside her in the driver's seat, Roy was a statue of coiled tension, his gaze fixed on the warehouse, his hand never straying from his weapon. Walter's order had been absolute: stay in the car. But with every passing second, the command felt less like a protection and more like a cage. Her brother was in there. The man she had, against all logic, come to love was in there, and she was waiting. A sudden, muffled shout from within the building made her jump. It was followed by the splintering crash of wood and a sickening, heavy thud. Clara's blood ran cold. Roy cursed under his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped the steering wheel. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "The plan is in motion," Roy said, his voice a low, gravelly reassurance that did nothing to soothe her. "Trust him." But Clara's trust was being eroded by a tidal wave of fear. She couldn't just sit here. She couldn't. Before Roy could stop her, she pushed open the heavy car door and slipped out into the damp, salty air, the bag still clutched in her hand. She ignored Roy's hissed "Clara," and crept along the shadowed wall of the neighboring building, her heart in her throat. She found a grimy, broken window on the side of the cannery, its glass long gone. Peering through the opening, she could see the vast, cavernous interior, lit by a few bare, dangling light bulbs that cast long, dancing shadows. In the center of the space, she saw them. Eugene was tied to a chair, his small face pale and terrified, his eyes wide with fear. Clarence Vance stood beside him, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face, a pistol held casually in his hand. A handful of his brutish men were positioned around the room. And then she saw Walter. He was standing alone in the center of the floor, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, the packet of deeds held in one hand. "The deeds, Blackwood," Vance said, his voice echoing in the huge space. "Place them on the barrel and kick them over. Then we can conclude our business." "Let the boy go first," Walter replied, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the danger he was in. "Our business is with each other." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I don't think so. You see, I've come to realize that my true leverage isn't the boy. It's what he represents. Your newfound weakness. Your heart." He gestured with the pistol toward Eugene. "After I have your docs, I think I'll keep him." A permanent reminder of who is in charge. The sheer sadistic cruelty of it stole Clara's breath. Walter's face, even in the dim light, became a mask of pure, cold fury. He knew, as did she, that Vance would never let either of them live. "That's not going to happen," Walter said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. And then in the high, shadowy rafters above, something moved. Clara's eyes shot upward. She saw them then, the figures that had slipped into the warehouse from the roof, while Vance's attention was on the main door. Walter's men. He hadn't come alone. He had come prepared. He had used himself as the bait. Walter dropped the deeds. It was the signal. All at once the warehouse erupted into orchestrated chaos. From the rafters, two of Walter's men dropped heavy cargo nets onto the thugs positioned below, tangling them in a writhing, cursing mess. From a side entrance, another group of Walter's loyalists burst in, Roy among them, moving with brutal efficiency. Vance, momentarily stunned, reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed Eugene, pulling the boy from the chair and holding him as a human shield, the pistol pressed against his temple. "Stay back," he screamed, his smug composure dissolving into raw panic. Walter had already started moving, not toward Vance, but toward a large, rusty lever on a nearby control panel. With a guttural roar, he wrenched it downward. A deafening grinding of gears filled the air as an old, massive conveyor belt used for hauling crates of fish shuddered to life. A series of heavy iron hooks hanging from the belt began to move along their track, directly over Vance's head. Vance was trapped, his escape cut off by Roy and his men, the machinery bearing down on him. In his panic, he made his final mistake. He shoved Eugene away from him, sending the boy stumbling to the floor, and turned to fire at Walter. But Walter was faster. A pistol had appeared in his hand as if from nowhere. A single deafening shot echoed through the cannery. Vance cried out, clutching his shoulder, the same shoulder he had wounded on Walter, and his gun clattered to the concrete floor. At the same moment, one of the descending iron hooks snagged the back of his coat, lifting him off his feet, his screamer of terror turning into a choked gurgle as he was hoisted into the air and carried helplessly toward the dark, grinding more of the machinery at the far end of the warehouse. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. Clara didn't wait. She scrambled through the broken window, heedless of the jagged glass, and ran. "Eugene." The boy looked up, his eyes wide, and when he saw her, his face crumpled with relief. "Clara." She fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his hair. The scent of him, the feel of his small, trembling body in her arms, a feeling more precious than life itself. He was safe. He was alive. Walter walked toward them, his face grim, his pistol now gone. He knelt beside them, his hand coming to rest gently on Eugene's back. "He's all right," he said, his voice rough with the aftermath of battle. "Let's go home." The journey back to the mansion was the complete opposite of the one that had brought them to the docks. Eugene, wrapped in the warm blanket from his bag and sitting between Walter and Clara, had quickly fallen into an exhausted sleep, his head resting in his sister's lap. Clara stroked his hair, her tears falling silently onto his head, each one a testament to her terror and her overwhelming relief. She looked at Walter. He was leaning back against the leather seat, his eyes closed. He looked drained, the violence of the night having taken a steep toll. He hadn't just rescued her brother. He had risked his entire world, exposed himself to his most vicious rival, and walked willingly into a trap, all for them. When they arrived back at the house, the first pale light of dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose. Walter carried the sleeping boy up the grand staircase to a guest room that the staff had already prepared, tucking him into the soft bed with a gentleness that made Clara's heart ache. They stood in the hallway outside the room, the house silent around them. The contract was, for all intents and purposes, fulfilled. He had saved her brother. She had played her part. "You're free to go, Clara," Walter said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the closed door of Eugenia's room. "The agreement is honored. I'll arrange for a house for you and Eugene, somewhere safe, far from the city. I'll provide for his continued treatment, for his education. You will want for nothing. You can have your life back." It was everything she had wanted, everything she had dreamed of when she first made this impossible bargain. Freedom, a life with her brother, away from this world of shadows and danger. But as she looked at the man standing before her, the man who listened to opera, who tended roses, who had faced down death for her brother, she knew that the life she had once known no longer existed. Her world had irrevocably changed. Her heart was no longer her own. To leave him now would not be freedom. It would be a different kind of prison, a life sentence of loneliness. "I don't want my old life back," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet hall. "And I don't want a new house." He finally turned to look at her, his slate-gray eyes filled with a weary confusion. "What do you want, then?" "I want to stay," she said. "With you." A flicker of disbelief, of a hope he had not dared to entertain, crossed his face. He took a hesitant step toward her. "Clara, you know what my world is. You saw it tonight. It's violent and it's ugly. You and your brother. You deserve better. You deserve peace." "I've learned that peace isn't about the absence of storms," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "It's about having an anchor in the storm. I think you're my anchor, Walter. And perhaps I can be yours." Slowly, tenderly, he reached out and took her left hand. He looked down at the simple, elegant diamond ring he had placed there as a symbol of their cold contract. With his other hand, he carefully slid it from her finger. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had misread everything, that he was truly letting her go. The loss was a physical pang, sharp and devastating, but he didn't let go of her hand. Instead, holding the ring between his thumb and forefinger, Walter Blackwood, the most feared man in the city, sank to one knee on the plush runner of the silent, dawn-lit hallway. He looked up at her, his eyes, once so cold and unreadable, now shining with a raw, vulnerable light she had never seen before. "Clara Mayfield," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "The first time I put this ring on your finger, it was a brand of ownership, a term of a contract. I am asking you now if you would wear it again, not as Mrs. Blackwood, the socialite, but as Clara, my wife. Not as a deal, but as a promise to build a real life from the wreckage of our past, a promise to be your anchor if you will be mine." Tears streamed freely down her face now, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, impossible joy. She looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the ring glittering in his hand, and she saw not a gilded cage, but the key to a future she had never imagined. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Walter, yes." He slid the ring back onto her finger. It felt different this time. It felt warm. It felt real. It felt like home. He stood, and without a word, wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into an embrace that was both a shield from the world and a promise of a new one, built not on a transaction, but on the unshakable foundation of danger, sacrifice, and a love that had bloomed in the darkest of places. True love is not always found in the light. Sometimes it is forged in the shadows of desperation and danger. It teaches us that behind the hardest exteriors can lie the most vulnerable hearts, and that the greatest acts of courage are not born from strength, but from the desperate need to protect what we have unexpectedly grown to cherish. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, but building a future worthy of sacrifice. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.